Hello, Internet. We are live.
Hey everyone, welcome to episode 56 of the Stanford MLSys seminar series. Sorry, I have a plane going over my head, but yeah, we're back with me, Karan, and as always, we have with us Dan,
Hey.
Theodore, Piero,
Hello.
and our guest today, Fait Poms from Stanford. We're going to be talking to Faye today about interactive model development. He's been working a lot on bringing kind of domain experts into the machine learning loop. And she'll be telling us a little bit about that. As always, we're going to do a 30-minute talk followed by a 30-minute podcast style discussion where you in the live audience on YouTube can ask questions and we'll get those across to Faye. You can also put your questions in chat during the talk and we'll keep track of them and try to get those across when the talk is finished. A little bit about Faye as well as the talk. Faye is a PhD student at Stanford, advised by Kayvon Fatahalian, and a senior applied research scientist at Snorkel. She typically works on algorithms and systems to help domain experts define, train, and validate computer vision models. And she's done a bunch of internships at Snorkel, Facebook, and NVIDIA, and put a lot of work into production as well at Snorkel and Facebook. So very happy to have you, Faye, and take it away.
Oh, great. Thanks for the introduction. Yeah, let's just get started. So as researchers, building models today, as we all know, requires a healthy amount of patience and typically access to sizable human and compute resources. To go sort of give an example of that, the domain expert who understands whatever the downstream application is has to painstakingly define a specification for the task. And this could take potentially days. The specification then gets passed down, potentially hundreds of human annotators to label that data, potentially taking days or even weeks. And then when these labels finally come back, they're used to train a model, and that model might sweep through a bunch of configurations or various other sorts of AutoML type operations, and that could take hours to days. And then finally, this model is then validated by labeling a lot more data and evaluating over it. And if any problems come up in this invalidation, like the performance is not good enough or it's capturing the wrong concept, it can require repeating this whole process, meaning potentially weeks to months per full iteration cycle. This pipeline can produce highly accurate state-of-the-art models. People have been using this for this kind of flow for a lot of production machine learning models. But the latency of iterating this approach is so high because it's not particularly agile. Each phase takes so long and has to be completed before the next. And the domain expert who determines when this iteration is actually necessary is mostly confined to task specification, which happens pretty infrequently. However, if the domain expert was more involved in other parts of the model building process, they could potentially detect and fix specification or labeling or modeling issues much earlier. And so this gets at our core research hypothesis. We believe that we can build models much more quickly, much more efficiently than is possible today by actually involving the domain expert at the right points in the model building loop so that they can rapidly determine changes to the spec, to how to label the data, or how much training data is needed, and so on. And I don't just mean involving the domain expert as in managing the loop, but actually in performing some of the essential operations of labeling data, training models, and validating them. But the reason people don't do this today is that in order to have a single expert with limited time involved, things have to be fast. Everything actually needs to be interactive and tightly integrated with that expert so that the system actually amplifies their valuable time rather than wasting it. So this includes making the expert efficient at labeling potentially hundreds of data points at once, deciding when to ask the expert and when to just use machines to automate decisions, determining what information we need to surface to the expert to make them effective, and what kinds of new interfaces will support this type of interactive machine learning. And I want to emphasize this is not about democratizing machine learning. We assume here that the domain expert is someone who is already training, for example, computer vision models. Someone like myself or probably a lot of other people on this call. And our goal is actually to make them more efficient, not to enable people who don't know how to build models already. And so we aren't there just yet. But for the rest of this talk, I want to talk about some initial significant steps that we've made toward interactive model development, starting with how we can actually train deep models on a tight labeling budget of a single expert, to discussing how to actually then validate these models without labeling a large validation set, and how to provide confidence that that validation is accurate. And finally, an initial system for enabling interactive model development that lets a single expert rapidly define tasks, label data, and soon to actually train and validate models. Now, in all this work, we mostly focus on the long tail of categories, because this is where most categories are in the real world. So for example, these two plots show the number of images for each category, sorted in descending order from left to right by number of images, in two well-known and recent computer vision data sets that actually model natural category distributions. As you can see inside the red ovals here, the long tail actually makes up the vast majority of categories. But the individual categories themselves are actually quite rare. This means that a domain expert, starting out with a new data set, trying to build a model for one of these categories, is faced with finding these rare instances, sort of like needles in a haystack. So that's the setting we're focusing on. And given that, let's actually get into how we can assist a domain expert in training models for these individual categories in the tail. So to use a running example, let's say we want to build a model for identifying this kind of type of rare bird, which we took from the long-tailed dataset iNaturalist, which is one of the examples I just showed. So in this case, our problem setup is that we have a couple of starting examples of the rare category, and we have a large amount of data from the iNaturalist dataset, which contains thousands of images of other birds, with a very small number of those images being the category we're interested in, which is highlighted in green here, and a small number of images which are very similar, but not actually the same species of birds. So these are fine-grained hard negatives, which you can see in red on the right. So we have that, and we have a domain expert who is tightly integrated and actually trying to find instances of these birds to label in order to train a model. So our goal then is to produce the most accurate model we can, given a fixed budget of expert labels. So for those of you familiar with the literature, this setup is basically the active learning setup. However, existing active learning techniques don't work well in this setting because methods like margin and entropy sampling assume that you begin with a reasonable model and then attempt to refine it. But here our initial models are not good because we start with so little initial training data. And it is actually quite hard to train a good fine-grained model in general, as you can see how difficult it is to distinguish between this Kentucky warbler on the right and these other birds, which are from a different category, which are not Kentucky warblers, and so are actually negatives. So for example, if you were to take an ordering of images sorted by, let's say, some initial model score, it might look something like this, with higher scores on the left and lower scores on the right. The green here represents positive instances, and the red represents hard negatives, and the gray is just any other negative instance. And as you can see, even in the top of the distribution, there's actually significant confusion about the target category. So methods that focus on the margin don't tend to be particularly effective because they don't actually find the region where the model is having a hard time distinguishing between examples. So you might say, oh, well, we can use something like semi-supervised learning to train better models without actually requiring the human to label more data, making it so that we don't actually, you have to use that human expert budget. But this doesn't quite work because semi-supervised methods will actually mislabel hard negatives as positives. For example, if you take label propagation, which tries to propagate positive labels to other examples that an initial model thinks are likely positives, This actually results in also labeling hard negatives instances as positives because the model is having a hard time differentiating them, even in the top of the distribution. Active learning methods will misuse the domain expert's time by asking them to label less useful examples. And also, just even labeling that much data to begin with with a single expert is difficult. On the other hand, semi-supervised methods that generate many labels by automatically labeling data will label positives as hard negatives, or will label hard negatives as positives, which will make the training set very noisy. So instead of expecting the domain expert to actually label all of the data as an active learning, or completely relying on an automatic method such as semi-supervised, we can actually go back to our main hypothesis, which is about making judicious use of the domain expert's time by focusing the domain expert to the few difficult positive and negative instances, and then actually using machines to label enough other data to then train deep models with. So what this looks like is the domain expert is tasked with differentiating between the positives and hard negatives in the high scoring region at the top. And then the machine handles labeling the bulk of the data as negatives in the low scoring region, where it's actually quite unlikely that there are positive examples. So what we're doing here is we're splitting up the problem into an easy and hard part, saving the expert time by using the machine to handle the vast majority of labeling the easy parts, and then letting the domain expert focus on the hard problems. So given just a small amount of human labels, we can now actually produce a fairly low noise training set with hundreds of labels. However, there's a couple challenges here that you actually need to solve to make this practical. First, as you might have noticed here, the training set is highly imbalanced. There's 5 positives, 18 hard negatives, and 700 negatives. That's quite an imbalanced data set. And training deep models on extremely imbalanced data with only a couple of positives in general is quite difficult. So second, if we don't want the expert waiting around for hours, which kind of defeats the point of saving their time, we actually need to make updates to the model fast enough that the domain expert isn't sort of waiting around twiddling their thumbs. So what we found, going back to challenge 1, with training deep models on extremely imbalanced data, is that standard deep learning methods, and even methods actually tailored for imbalanced learning, don't work particularly well for this kind of extreme negative or background imbalance. So just to summarize quickly, the 2 primary approaches for dealing with imbalanced data are bias sampling and reweighting. Bias sampling increases the frequency that the model sees positive examples in a training batch, basically by increasing their frequency artificially, which you can see here by the green dots in this batch, which is much higher than their actual proportion in the data set. Reweighting, on the other hand, keeps the sampling the same, but actually increases the loss, essentially the weight on positive examples. However, in the case of extremely imbalanced data, both of these approaches unfortunately encourage overfitting to the positives and thus do not generalize well past the training set. However, we know that training typically works with more balanced data. So our idea was actually to artificially reduce imbalance by automatically labeling data with thousands of pseudo categories. This effectively transforms the problem into a more balanced one by using predictions from off-the-shelf pre-trained ImageNet models, or even by actually clustering self-supervised embeddings, so you don't actually need any labels if you'd like, to form pseudo categories. And using this approach, we've actually been able to train models on data sets with even up to a 1 to 1,000 imbalance ratio between the positives and negatives, despite how simple the actual kind of approach is. And critically, what this means for interactive model development is that we can now save the domain expert time by letting us make use of large amounts of automatically labeled negative data instead of asking for more human labels that might be more precise. So now that we can actually train models on imbalanced data sets, we now have to figure out how do we actually make model updates quick so that the domain expert is always working on the hardest examples for the current model. And the reason we're updating this model is because at some point, the expert actually will exhaust the hard labels in the high scoring region. And so we need to actually iteratively improve the model so that the domain expert focuses on that, essentially whatever is hardest for the current training, the model trained on the current training set. But each iteration, if you were to do standard deep learning, means that the expert is waiting around for the model to train. And that takes a very long time, potentially hours. So instead of expensive deep model training every iteration, we made the observation that if the training data set hasn't changed drastically, then we can actually only change the part of the model which is likely to change the most, which is just the model's classifier. And we know how to train that very quickly because of decades of research into training SVMs. So we can frequently update the model by using the embeddings computed, essentially cached from the prior model as features for training an SVM, but using the newly collected labels from the most recent iteration. And once we've collected enough data, then we can actually update the deep model, but at a much lower frequency. So you always have an up-to-date model, and your features are progressively updated as more data is collected. So this way, the domain expert's time is always focusing on sort of the hardest or most relevant examples instead of sitting idle or looking at stale data. And so now we can actually update deep models quickly and train on extremely imbalanced data, which makes this approach feasible. So how well does this work? The plot here shows accuracy of models trained using different methods as a function of human effort. So the y-axis is the mean F1 score of the models across, basically averaged across 50 categories in the iNaturalist dataset. The x-axis is the number of domain expert labeled images per category. So essentially more images labeled means more human effort. And what we find is that our method can reach the accuracy of a fully supervised model, which is the dotted line at the top, in just 500 labels per category. Baseline semi-supervised and active learning methods, which are some of the other lines here, which is not the red line, require many more samples to reach that accuracy. And also don't produce as good of a model in the early iterations. So stepping back a bit, what we've done is to make it more feasible to train models with a single domain expert by reducing the total number of human labels we need. And this goal is, pretty similar to other efforts in semi-supervised, self-supervised, few shot, But what we haven't addressed is that we still need to label lots of data for then validating these models, right? So it's sort of a Amdahl's law situation. And so while by decreasing the training labeling costs quite a lot, the main dominant cost of labeling is actually now validation. So we actually still need many human labels overall, which makes it then difficult for a single domain expert to build models. So this brings us back to our recent work on actually validating models with fewer labels. So the goal here is to reduce the total labels much further by not reducing the training label cost, by actually reducing the total validation labels needed. So in other words, we'd like essentially, to state this problem more precisely, we'd like to estimate performance metrics like precision, recall, F1 MAP, but we don't want to have the expert exhaustively label all the data in order to estimate that. So instead, what we like to do is actually sample a subset of the data set to label. But this means that now we actually have an estimate of the performance metric. And obtaining an accurate estimate is actually just a statistical estimation problem. So then our goal actually is to find an accurate estimator of the performance metric, F1 or MAP, given a limited domain expert budget. So the most straightforward estimator, if you were to just try the most simple thing, is just uniform random sampling. And it's an unbiased estimator. As you can see at the top of the slide, to sort of like walk through what this would look like, we're showing the distribution examples in the validation set. And for illustration purposes, the green dots here they're not predictions before, they're actually ground truth positives. And the gray dots are negatives. So you wouldn't actually have access to this information, typically, because that would require labeling the data, but this is for illustration purposes. But prior to sampling, we don't actually know these labels, right? So if we were to sample and then label a couple of points, according to uniform sampling, we might get this result, which contains no positives because most of the data is negatives. However, and if you sample a couple more times, you might see something like this, where you'll find no positives for most sample sizes, or you might find one or something like that. But effectively what this does is it means that this estimator using uniform random sampling has extremely high variance, especially for small sample counts, which is what we're focusing on, because we want a small amount of data to label. And we're looking at rare categories. Fortunately, there actually is an optimal sampling strategy which reduces variance. And as you can see here, when you use this method, the samples from the strategy consistently capture the rare positives. And what the sampling strategy requires is that we know which samples are likely to be positives. So essentially what this is equivalent to having what's called a well-calibrated model. However, most modern deep models are absolutely not well calibrated. And so what this means is that we have a sort of this chicken and egg problem, where if we had a calibrated model, well, then we know how to build optimal estimators. But calibrating models requires actually labeling data to fit the calibration to it. So instead, we actually take an iterative approach, which combines model calibration with the sampling strategy. And this enables us to get low variance estimates while only asking the domain expert for a few samples. And what's unique about this approach is that in addition to the estimate itself, we're also able to infer the variance of the estimate using actually just a single trial. And this is critical because it allows the domain expert to then monitor the quality of the estimate and to decide when it is accurate enough to stop labeling more data. Without this, you essentially wouldn't have a good estimate of how accurate or how far off you are from sort of the true value. And so essentially this allows this process to be a bit more interactive because the domain expert's understanding actually allows them to specify what they can tolerate and thus sort of control kind of how much data they end up needing to label. So how does this work? Well, our method, which is called ACIS, is able to predict the F1 score of a trained model far more accurately than most baseline approaches, particularly in the low sample regime, which is the regime that is most important because you're trying to reduce the amount of samples you need. So to explain this graph, the y-axis here is the mean squared error on a log scale. So that is basically a representation of the bias and variance in a single metric. The x-axis is the labeling budget on a log scale. So further to the left means less human effort. And the red line is our method, as before. So in some cases, what's actually surprising is our method requires a labeling budget of actually only 50 examples in order to estimate the ground truth F score with just down to a 0.01 mean squared error, which is quite good. Cool. Yeah, so taking a step back, this brings us to sort of where we've been going this whole time, which is actually putting these components together into a system for interactive model development. That will actually make it possible for a single domain expert to train a model in an afternoon rather than weeks or months. And we're definitely not completely there just yet, but we are starting to build it. We have an open source system called Forager. The code is publicly available on GitHub. You can go to this URL. You can install it by using pip, try it out yourself. I'm sure there's bugs in it. It's research code, but I would love to hear what you think. And when you fire Forager up, you'll actually see an interface that looks something like this. And what you can see here is basically a display of data from the Waymo open self-driving car data set that allows an expert to essentially rapidly explore and work with this data set. And like I said, this isn't a complete interactive model building system just yet. And the next version, we're actually going to be incorporating the training and validation components I just talked about into it. But I wanted to give you a preview of what interacting in Forager would look like. And to motivate why you would want an interactive system like this, that actually lets you explore your data. I'm going to sort of walk through an example. So something like, imagine, you were working with this self-driving car data set, and you wanted to build a model specifically to find, for example, taxi cabs in that data set. Well, if you're like me, then your first thought would be that you would be looking for something like, the classic yellow New York taxi cab, right? That's sort of the platonic ideal of a taxi cab. But of course, that's what I thought I would be looking for in this data set. But when you actually start looking, like when I actually started looking at images from Waymo, what you ended up seeing is that there's actually a pretty broad set of vehicles which count as taxis. And if I had sat down and instead of actually looking at the data myself, just gotten a bunch of, for example, human labelers or otherwise to start labeling the data set based upon the idea, the sort of maybe initial image of a yellow taxi cab, then I probably wouldn't have realized there's this shortcoming until much later, maybe after running the model or sort of serendipitously during deployment or something like that. But of course, the reason people don't do this is that looking through tens of thousands of images in Waymo can take days or potentially even weeks. And that has to be repeated for every new task that you want to train a model for. So this brings us back to Forager, which is an attempt to actually equip a domain expert with the sort of right set of tools that'll allow them to rapidly investigate their data and build models on it without having to manually page through all of that data. And so specifically, Forager provides a couple modes of exploration that are backed by massive amounts of compute and modern deep embeddings to make these tools really fast over large data sets. So for example, you can see here that we're looking at images in Waymo, and it's quite hard from this first glance to know what the rest of the data set looks like. So instead of manually paging through hundreds of images, you could simply cluster the data, and this will immediately pull out the major modes of the data set. And you can see here that there's different parts of the city, there's different weather conditions, and there's even some suburbs, which would have taken me much longer to look through all the data to find. And now let's say that you were interested in finding more of these suburb-like images, because you wanted to see, say, how your self-driving vehicle performed for less dense roadways, essentially not city areas. Well, then you could then run a search using Forager for similar images, and this will return a sorted list of new images that would appear based on their feature similarity to that source image. And so now we can see both sort of the cross product of using search and clustering is that you can see in this sorted list, not only have you found these kind of suburbs, we've also found sort of different modalities of those. So you can see there's a different sort of a spread of different type of suburb areas. And what's critical in that is that each of these operations, and it's sort of a key tenet of the Forager system, is that everything happens in somewhere around less than 5 seconds. And the reason for that is that it means that the expert is constantly in the loop. They're constantly engaged with refining the application. And this is the reason this is possible. The reason that we can make this work is that we're taking advantage of the massive amounts of scale-out compute that exists in the cloud, and also via, basically indexing of image features in order to allow us to do very fast searches. And of course, as an expert sort of honing in on a concept, they should also be able to tag whatever data they find relevant. So clicking on these clusters immediately records the expert's actions and allows you to label all these images in bulk in the cluster. And there's a way to sort of dive into these clusters and look at them individually, but you can label a large amount of data quite quickly just using this sort of initial set of tools. And eventually these, as we sort of integrate some of the research I just talked about, you essentially will be able to allow you to do all this exploration while training models and while validating them in an interactive manner. So stepping back, that's kind of where we're at right now. These sort of represent the first steps toward our hypothesis that model development can be made more efficient by making sure you involve the domain expert at the right points in the model building loop. So, a bit in contrast to a lot of other work that's trying to kind of remove the expert as much as possible. Some of these ways I just showed you. And as for next steps, there's actually still a lot of work to do in making the expert more efficient at labeling data. I just showed you one method, but there's potentially a lot of other ways to make that faster. And I'm not ready to talk about this just yet, since it's still a work in progress, but I'm hoping to have sort of a first stab at making domain expert labeling more efficient using essentially aggregate level annotations. So hopefully I can talk about that at some point in the future. But to conclude, I'd like to summarize with maybe some perhaps controversial takeaways. The first is that one of the most powerful lessons here, I think, is dividing the problem into specifically easy parts that can be automated and hard parts that humans can solve can massively improve your ability to work with large amounts of data while not taxing a single expert. The second is that I believe, and I think several others also, that validation is going to be one of the major costs for labeling data going forward, because it does require a human to sort of look at it in order to validate it, because you at some point need some amount of human validation or verification of the process. And sort of finally, this is maybe the kind of lesson that trying to show with Forager and some of this works, is that it is possible with a single expert with the right tools to be able to, the right low latency tools, specifically tools that are fast and return results in seconds instead of minutes or even hours, to be very effective at creating a model very quickly. So yeah, thanks for listening. Love to hear questions or anything else.
Thanks so much, Faye, for the talk. And I want to remind folks who are tuning in on YouTube to post your questions in chat, and we'll get those across to Faye. So just to kick things off, I guess, oh, the slide just disappeared. Yeah, I think one of the things I was curious about was I think like kind of the larger arc in terms of just using the system, like from beginning through end. I think you kind of broke it down into these pieces, like the training piece, and specifically tackling some of these challenges with imbalanced data and small data regimes, and as well as the validation piece and doing it kind of more efficiently. I'm just wondering, like, how you envision kind of assist a person walking through the system, and kind of the points at which you talked about this, I think, a little bit briefly about how larger scale retraining also happens in the background. I'm just curious, like kind of how does that proceed? Like, say you're sitting down for an hour trying to, build a classifier for those birds, I think warblers or whatever. Like, how would you kind of think about that in terms of, when training happens, when kind of the faster training iterations happen, and when the validation happens?
Yeah, so, sorry, just taking notes. I would say, I mean, this is almost a whole other talk by itself, but essentially there's like a bunch of kind of there's sort of phases I think you go through in building out a model, sort of essentially depending on how much labeled training data you have. So if you're starting out in a situation where you have no training data, or you have, like, for example, you don't even have any images or even any like representative examples, then you're in a regime where you're essentially what I think about as bootstrapping. You're trying to just find one example. So maybe what you can do is you can just search on Google or something like that. One of the tools that we actually have that incorporated into the system. But the other thing you can do is actually you can take advantage of a lot of these new zero-shot models, for example, like CLIP or other variants of CLIP, and actually search by a string. And that typically will find something which is, it's not going to find everything, like it doesn't have perfect precision or recall, but it will find some pretty good initial examples. So once you have some initial examples, then you're in a phase where you actually can train a very simple model. So you might do something like take an off-the-shelf set of embeddings, train an SVM, and you have a very simple model which you can then iterate on. Now you're sort of in this like initial like low labeled data few shot kind of setting with where you can actually start sort of refining. So you can start deploying very like modified active learning tools, which is what I showed in the paper, that know that you're working with this kind of rare data. Then once you have sort of a larger labeled set, then you actually can deploy sort of like all of the existing active learning literature that assumes you have a decent initial model. So you can deploy all of that kind of approach, or even, at any point in this, you could be deploying some form of weak labeling. So writing things like labeling functions, although it's quite hard to do that on images. You can kind of think of a zero-shot method as that, but and then once you have that sort of, highly tuned model from active learning, you then deploy, and there's sort of a feedback loop there. So I mean, I mostly think about it as split into how much labeled data do you have, what is the sort of quality of your model, and how do you then sort of progressively move through those phases. So essentially, this like the way that would work in the system is as you're moving through these phases, the system would know about that, and of course would be constantly training models in the background based upon whatever the most up-to-date labeled training data is. And then as you get to sort of thresholds where you have enough data, it will then switch what model type it's looking at. So from an SVM, even just like starting with like KNN-based search, if you have very little data, to an SVM on fixed features, to a trained model, and then sort of so on. So it's sort of a progressive thing as you move up in the amount of supervision that you have.
Yeah, I guess one quick follow-up was, to what degree do you think like the interface here matters? Because I can imagine that, as you said, as you were talking a little bit about like, like a lot of these things don't have perfect precision or recall, right? Like you're retrieving something using a search query, and often you'll get something that's like approximately right, and maybe you will actually not see the kind of examples that you might have been imagining in your head or looking for. And so to a certain degree, like it seems like part of that, at least intuitively, seems like it can be avoided through how you design the experience of actually being able to give people kind of a more global view of the data in some way. So to what degree is that something that you think about when you're designing kind of Forager and these interfaces, basically?
Yeah, so I mean, as you notice with some of the clustering stuff, like it's quite critical. Like I would say things like the thing with active learning is it's a very like depth first approach, right? Like active learning typically works best when you're trying to refine modes that you already understand, but it's not particularly great at working with unknown unknowns, basically modes that you don't know about. So that's where these other sort of exploration tools, things like clustering, let you actually get a broader view of things. Yeah. So there's definitely a question here around like, given you have a trained model and you sort of want to refine, how do you then also sort of like look at the broad space of data? And I have some like initial ideas there around looking at, you can look at visualizations of embedding spaces or things like that in order to get a kind of some sort of idea of what that looks like. But it is a fundamentally hard problem to address that question of essentially unknown unknowns. Basically, the things that you don't know are part of the category that you're looking for.
Yeah.
I mean, outside of like unsupervised methods or methods that are, I mean, I think one optimal way to do this is if you had some way to sort of like describe the features that were relevant to the thing that you're looking at, and then that your data could then be split by those features. That could be a way to sort of find these kinds of like modes that you otherwise wouldn't have explored. But it's a really interesting question that, there's the whole sort of like, once you have a model trained, how does that feed back into the whole process and how that looks like that. I think a lot of these tools could work for, but I haven't thought about it I've mostly been focusing on the earlier part of the process where you have a little bit of training data, and there's sort of the whole production part where you have a lot of training data and you're like feeding that back in an iterative loop that I think is really interesting. And there's a lot of work to do there. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
So kind of following up on that, one of the questions I had, I thought that figure that you had where, the closest labels, like some of them, like a very few of them were green, but a lot of them were hard negatives. I thought that was a really compelling figure. I was wondering, how do you know kind of if you're in that regime or if you are in one of these regimes that maybe the active learning people have thought about before, where maybe the hard examples are further down along the boundary? Like, how do you know if you're in the regime where maybe it is okay to just take the n closest things and just label them as positive versus one of these other regimes where it seems to be much trickier, where you have to actually carefully look at all those close images?
Yeah, I mean, the nice thing about that regime is that it's actually fairly easy to know when you're in it, because it's essentially just saying like, how is your model precise? Like, does it have some notion of precision? Um, so you can actually just look at the things that it predicts as positives and just like randomly sample those and say which of these are what percentage of these are
Mm.
actually true positive and which are false positive. So that gives you a decent look at it. The other thing you can do is you can bucket you can essentially bucket your distribution into like score like regions. So like 0.9 to 1.0, like confidence, all the way down to 0.5 or something like that, and just look at those and see like what is the density of positives versus like hard negatives. And basically just you can get a pretty quick eye level view of like, okay, it seems like the model is either functioning well in like some region or it's having issues. Or you can just look at the margin and say, is the margin informative? Like, how many positives are there here? So yeah, you can, there's a couple ways to do it. But typically I would say, like, if you have a lot of training data, like if you have several thousand examples, you're typically in the regime where you can use things like off-the-shelf active learning. But if you're talking about like this liminal space of like few shot or like a little bit above few shot, like 20 or 30 examples, you're usually in the regime where you are having a hard time. I mean, this isn't universally true. Obviously, it depends on the task, but that's kind of my rule of thumb.
Gotcha. Thanks.
Yeah.
In fact, I'm super curious about one aspect that you briefly touched upon, but maybe, it would be great to have a little bit of more details on, which is for the unbalanced data problem, you told us that you were using the pseudo labels approach. And, can you give us a little bit more insight into that? Because I think it's a problem that many people encounter. And so that kind of solution may not be as well known as other people may benefit from knowing about that solution.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a surprisingly simple idea. Essentially, so the problem we found is that we wanted to train these models in this rare category regime where we were labeling a lot of data, and we end up with training sets that had, let's say, like 15 positives and maybe like 800 negatives, and that matched what the ratio of positives to negatives in the sort of test distribution. And what we found was that when you trained models on this, they would essentially just overfit, or they just wouldn't train at all, because the few amount of positives means that it's very easy for them to memorize that data, or to simply just predict everything as negative, because like the loss is essentially, it's like very hard for a loss to focus on a small amount of data, right? So effectively, the solution there that we found was that instead of trying to fix the primary loss, instead of trying to make it so that loss looked like something else, and we basically just kept that the same. And what we observed was that the model was essentially, you can think of it as it's like collapsing. There's sort of like a feature collapse where, because the problem is so easy, because most examples are negatives, like 99.99% of examples are negatives, the model essentially destroys its features if you start with a pre-trained model, because it doesn't need to differentiate between any of those negative examples. It's like, it can just trivially say that they're negative. It only essentially needs to know what the positive examples are, which is a very small set. And so it essentially loses most of its discriminative power. So the way that we solved that was essentially we added another loss. It's essentially a multitask loss, where the primary loss is exactly the same as the classification loss for two categories. But the secondary loss is actually asking the model to learn to predict the labels produced by the predictions of some other pre-trained model. So it's a little bit counterintuitive, because the labels don't actually correspond to any of the labels in the target data set. For example, on iNaturalist, we use like ImageNet, and ImageNet does not have most of the categories in iNaturalist. And what we found was that you could literally just apply ImageNet, or even an off-the-shelf self-supervised method, which has no categories, and you could just cluster those to produce labels. And you could apply that model onto the target data set and produce essentially what are pseudo labels, essentially labels that for categories which don't actually exist in that data set. So it might say that this is like, it might say that this data set, it might say that this set of images are like a walrus or something when there's no walruses in that data set, but they are semantically coherent. So if you look at those images, they look semantically coherent. They're capturing some semantic concept. They just aren't capturing like the walrus concept. And if you train the model jointly on those two tasks, what happens is that it essentially splits the data. It turns it into a more balanced problem by making the model predict, essentially differentiate between all these negatives that otherwise it would have just been able to easily say are negative. And so what this does is it forces the features to be discriminative, to basically to focus on even examples that otherwise are uninteresting to it, while still trying to optimize the primary loss. And so what that means is that you maintain the features while fine-tuning them for the purposes of the target, the target new category. And it works surprisingly well. Obviously, it depends on, like, if it does require some amount of like, if you're trying to train on a medical data set and you're using ImageNet, like, that might not work as well because there's such a giant domain shift. But for a lot of the examples, like even for a lot of the data sets we worked with, it worked quite well just using ImageNet or something self-supervised. So
that's great. It basically imposes like a constraint or like a soft constraint.
Yeah,
on top
exactly.
of
It's like regularization, basically.
It's kind of regularization. Yeah, exactly. That makes a lot of sense. And thank you for sharing this. This is super useful.
Yeah. It's shockingly simple and easy to use. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Fait, I wanted to know your thoughts about kind of large unlabeled data sets. In cases where you do know roughly like what proportion of the data will be positive examples, and then also in cases where you don't. So did you ever have to make any kind of implicit assumptions about how many positive examples you had? And if not, like, is there a way to use that kind of information to help guide some of these methods?
Yeah, so you're sort of talking about what the frequency of the category is?
Yes.
Yeah. So that's a really good question. So because we were focusing on rare categories, what that typically meant in the data sets we're looking at is they were either like 0.1% or less of the data set, 0.1 or sometimes 0.01. So we usually just like, there was this sort of like kind of rough assumption that essentially everything we assumed that so in the actual like algorithm for example validation, where we're doing this kind of active sampling, this joint approach, there is an assumption about the data that we're looking at having a less than 1% frequency, and that gets refined through the process, but it is a rough initial estimate. And so yeah, if you had a better estimate of that, it would make the problem a lot easier, because you would know kind of, it would inform sort of kind of how to sample in a data set. In general, it's quite, so I mean, in general, it's quite hard. It's a value it's another like sort of chicken and egg problem, because if you know what the frequency is, then you have like, essentially you've sampled enough data in order to know the frequency, and it's not as bad as like having to label all the data for the model, but it is.
Yeah,
it is,
or you might have some outside source for
Yeah.
like how often something occurs. Yeah.
Yeah, so if you know the frequency of it, it can help a lot, because essentially it allows you to know kind of how many examples are going to be roughly in the data set, and so you can know sort of like how much you're missing. So for the purposes of exploration or trying to find kind of unknown unknowns, it allows you to know like, oh, I'm missing like 50% of my data, or sort of like where you should look in the distribution. Like should I look in the top, should I look at the top 1%, the top 0.01%? And so it allows you to sort of like have a bit of a, to find examples more efficiently, or to basically have more diagnostic information.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Faye, I wanted to bring up one of the questions in the YouTube chat. So Christian from YouTube or the YouTube chat is interested in the variability of expert quality. And are you considering this uncertainty in your future work? So for instance, what happens if your expert is wrong? And or generally, humans are human. We make mistakes. So have you thought about that aspect at all?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I mean, I think a core assumption in our work is essentially that the expert is right. And the reason we have that assumption is because or at least like they are the one who's determining the answers to these questions. Because, for example, when you're trying to define a model for a new category or a new task, typically like what that even means, like what the task means, is actually pretty undefined. Like if you go out and start looking at real data, you might think you know what it is in your head, but then you go look at the data and you're actually like, oh, I was wildly underspecified, or I wildly forgot about some other particular category. And so it's actually quite hard to divorce the definition of the problem from some expert. We kind of do this in computer vision or research because someone somewhere like defined like a category or defined a problem. And a lot of the times their definition is actually not precise. Like if you go look at computer vision data sets right now and you go look at categories or you go look at like the labels on something, you'll actually find a lot of errors or even inconsistencies. So it's a bit difficult to separate that, right? Like, it's like, what does it mean for the expert to be low quality? Like they are the expert, right? But yeah, I mean, I guess maybe the question is around like different levels of technical ability, or
Yeah, potentially like they mentioned, matching up harder images. I think just reading the text, like maybe matching up images with different experts or
Hmm.
collecting more labels from maybe in a crowd worker setting, or maybe there's the expert at your company, and then there's the people down the hall who are on their coffee break, and you're like, yo, can you come label some data for me? Not that I've ever done that in the past.
Yeah. Well, actually, yeah, I mean, that's a good question. There's actually, I mean, there's a lot of, for example, ways in which the pipeline that I talked about actually could incorporate like a crowdsource, like, for example, you can imagine an expert labeling a bunch of initial data in order to sort of collect a kind of like a convex, like the whole of like what, like essentially like the positives and hard negatives that they think are probably that representative of the category, and then shipping those off to some labelers, and then but only shipping them the data that is informed by the expert, like filtering the data or sorting it in a particular way and saying, I don't want to look at like this. I'm pretty sure that these 1,000 images are going to be positives, but I'm going to ship them off to labelers to then label them in order to save that expert's time. So there's definitely ways you could think of like hybrid approaches where the expert like kind of provides this high level. I'm not like, I don't want the expert, ideally the expert's not just like binary labeling images or, providing some kind of label like that, but they are providing this higher level supervision that they uniquely know how to provide. And then they're shipping off the kind of more rote task of binary labeling. I mean, there's the problem is there's a lot of tasks where you simply can't do that. Like, for example, like one of the people that we've talked with a couple of years ago was some folks from the Monterey Bay Research Aquarium Institute. And one of the things they have to do is like they have all this underwater sea footage, and they want to essentially like differentiate between one of like 5,000 different fish species, and looking at these like really grainy videos. And it would simply not, it's like not, I don't think it would be possible to train like someone doesn't have a PhD in marine biology, which is who is doing the labeling, to be able to do that task. So that's kind of, I think that's that's sort of the like, extreme of the case that we want to target, basically like one expert or even one or two experts that want to be able to do this and who simply would not be able to do it, or simply would be spending essentially hours and hours of their time doing it right now.
Right.
Yeah.
I will say, I don't think you need a PhD in marine biology. I do go scuba diving a lot. I'm pretty sure you could teach me, because then when I look at the fish, I'm going to point at it, take a video, and be like, I know what that fish is.
I think what I mean here more is that you could teach someone, but you would end up spending so much money teaching them that I don't know if it would be worth
Right.
it, because it's like you have 5,000 different species of fish, and like you could do some sort of like, you know, tree-based like thing where you would do an ontology and you kind of filter down. But I think it would actually be quite expensive to train someone to do that who's not maybe not a PhD in marine biology, but at least like has trained for the problem. And
Right.
yeah, it's quite, I think it's, yeah, there are problems like that where are quite specific to the target domain.
Awesome. Yeah, Dan, I think you're overestimating your ability to label all the fishies, but thanks, Faye, for a great talk and discussion. I think we're just about at time. I want to thank everybody in the audience for tuning in, and go to our website, mlsys.stanford.edu, and subscribe to our mailing list, and subscribe to our channel, like this video, and tell your friends. We're going to be back next week with...
Next week, we've got VJ Reddy from Harvard. He's going to be talking about tiny machine learning.
Okay, awesome. Yeah. So see you next week. Bye.
Bye, YouTube. 1 second. I'm looking for the button. All right. Bye, YouTube, for real.